We're all set, Alex? So welcome to the Finance Committee meeting. Meeting is in session for October 28th, 2015. And we'll start with the first item on the agenda, review of the minutes. So are there any comments, additions, or deletions, or clarifications to the minutes? Sure.
I thought that I asked about what was the traditional increase in taxes per year, and a comment about it being lower than inflation, but I don't see anything here. I think it was a 1.75 to a 2.5% range, and then we commented about inflation. I may be missing it, but I'm skim reading as fast as I can.
I think you're right. And that was in the agenda item C, if I recall, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because that's what we were talking about taxes.
And it was before we talked about, contracts. So I'd say if we're on page 3, if we could put it, it seems like on page 3, 2/3 of the way down, JG is you, and you had a question about who's on the
Members.
who are the members, and I think you followed up with another question there. So what's your best recollection of the question?
I asked what was the average rate of increase each year, and the answer given was approximately 1.75 to 2.5%. And my response was that seems to be below inflation per year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Depends on the index. Excuse me.
Oh, here it is. Is this where you asked? Page 4?
So Angela, does that make sense on page 3, or is it on page?
Yeah.
No, she's might be right on page 4 at the top.
Page 4 at the top. JG asked if there's been an increase in taxes.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so it's there.
Well, that's
Sorry, I
right.
missed it the first through.
Thank you.
Did he actually, I just have one, did Mr. Tripp actually say that the town's running a lot smoother because of the Taxpayers Association? Did he say that? I don't recall him saying that.
He was taking credit.
Credit for, okay.
Maybe not directly, where he says it wasn't for us, but, you know.
Okay.
I mean, he wasn't there, I think
Yeah,
clearly he was an influence, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got through a rough time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
woke people up.
Okay, so what do you think was the best way to do it? So Jennifer, do you think on page 4, do you want to add another line right in there in the exchange?
Right after the asked if there's an increase in taxes,
Okay.
please.
And so we'd add 2 lines. One line would be Mr. Tripp saying, 1.75 to 2.5%. And then,
My response was, that seems to be below the average inflation per year.
right.
Thank you.
Does that make sense, Angela? Should we read it into the, so why don't we read it into the record and then we can, actually, I don't quite know the parliamentary way to do this, but I think we can just say, if someone were to offer a motion to amend
Yeah.
the minutes, and then if Angela were to read what we think is the best recollection of the minutes, and then we'll vote on it.
Motion to amend the minutes as printed.
Okay.
Second.
Does someone want to read what we agreed?
Do I read?
Yeah, sure.
Your turn.
Angela doesn't have a mic, so.
Okay, great. Jennifer asked what the average increase in taxes per year is. Mr. Tripp responded with 1.75 to 2.5%. Jennifer responded, is correct, with that seems to be below the average rate of inflation per year. That,
Okay, I'll call all in favor of adopting the minutes as amended?
aye.
Well, any opposed? Okay. Okay, we're on to our second topic. We've invited Mr. Mailer, the town manager, in to talk about the Essex County retirement system and how much we're spending on it and what's going on in that, because it was one of the things we noticed last year is that the retirement assessment had been creeping up a little bit. We noticed it as a bump, and when I asked Andrew what the best way to find out about this could be, he said, I can come in and talk to you about it. So we're very thankful that you made yourself available to speak to us about this, and I think it's a better solution for us than going to the Essex board itself, and we probably get more timely information than we would have otherwise. So thank you very much for agreeing to come.
Well, just to give you some context, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions, I'm probably going to cover, I've given you an overview that really is to my benefit, so I can cover a number of different topics and try to do that in about 30 minutes or so. There's a lot of information, and from that I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, so I figure it's best to leave enough time to answer the appropriate questions. To give you some understanding of my background, I've served as chairman of 3 different retirement systems of the 105 that exist in Massachusetts. I've been chairman of the Town of Winthrop Retirement System, the City of Chelsea Retirement System, and for a period of time as chairman of the Essex Regional Retirement System. Back in 2010, I was appointed by the state to step in and fix some issues involved with the Essex Regional Retirement System, and when I accepted this position in North Andover, I needed to get off the board because I wasn't allowed to be both the town manager and the chairman and what they call 5th member of the board. So I certainly don't own all the rights on retirement systems, but I have some perspective in terms of how things have changed and how things have improved, and in some ways how they've not necessarily improved over the years. So if I can, what I'd like to do is just, again, go over this sheet. Anytime you have questions, feel free to ask whatever you'd like, and I'll respond as best I can. All retirement systems in Massachusetts are 105 that 104 currently. It was 105 as of last year. There was 106 some number of years ago, so there's been some consolidation. All are covered by Mass General Law, Chapter 32. That's the governing statute for all systems. Those systems can really hold one of 3 forms. They can be a local board. I've used examples here. The town of Andover, as an example, has a local retirement board. So the retirement system, as governed by Mass General Law, Chapter 32 in Andover, is governed by a local town of Andover retirement board. When I was in Swampscott, they had a local retirement board. There are regional boards like the Essex Regional Retirement System that covers a wider span of different governmental units, and then there are state units. The State Retirement Board, Mass Teachers are the biggest examples of those. I think Mass Teachers is the largest in terms of assets of retirement systems. So those will give you some examples. There's a state oversight body. They're called the Public Employee Retirement Administration Commission, or PERAC, or PRAC, depending on who you speak to. They used to be called PERA a decade ago, but now they're PERAC. I didn't get into the detail of how the members of that particular commission are appointed, but they're everything from the treasurer's, the state treasurer's office, the governor's office, a member of one of the major unions in the state, and their responsibility really is to serve as the oversight body to interpret some of these statutes as necessary, provide resources both from a legal perspective and from an actuarial perspective to each of the systems. Most applications for retirement are reviewed by them, especially disability retirements, to make sure that they're consistent with what people would expect as a response. Medical panels are coordinated with them for disability retirements. They have offices, at least They were up to last year in Somerville. I believe they're still in Somerville. They're headed up by an appointed executive director, who is a gentleman named Joe Connaughton. He's been in that position for, again, close to 2 decades. The Essex Regional Retirement System, what was originally called the Essex Regional Retirement Board, or ERRS, was founded in 1937. It was part of the Essex County system when we had some level of county government here. In 1996, it became a standalone regional retirement system when the county government in the area was abolished. And so under legislation, Mass General Law, Chapter 34B, Section 16, the retirement system as a standalone entity was created. Special legislation in 2010 amended the structure of that particular group. It really came on the heels of some of the irregularities that had begun to surface. There was a lot of press between both local and state press on some of the irregularities that began in, say, 08 and 09, operational irregularities, and some questions about some other issues happening at the retirement system itself. So the legislature had taken on the responsibility of looking at amending the existing statute to make some changes about membership. At the same time, PERAC had conducted an audit where I identified more than 24 irregularities, which were substantial enough to determine that they needed oversight of the Essex Regional Retirement System. And we can talk about that certainly further down on this list. So there are currently 47 entities that comprise the Essex Regional Retirement System. There were 48 until the Essex Aggie now has been moved through legislation into the Salem Retirement System. That includes 19 towns, of which North Andover is the largest, 17 housing authorities, 5 regional schools, and 6 special districts. An example would be the Linfield Water District. They have their own entity, and they're governed by this. Approximately 5,000 active, retired, or inactive members. I've given you the breakdown there of the different members. So about 5,000 current retirees, current employees, or inactives. An inactive is someone who may have served in municipal service and either hasn't reached retirement age or hasn't yet chosen to retire. So they are future retirees likely in the system. There's a 5-member board of directors for the Essex Regional Retirement System. This is not uncommon for most of the systems, have 5 board members. Years ago, when I started in 1995, was the first board that I served on. There were 3 members to the board. That was pretty common. It's grown to 5. 5 makes more sense. Not unlike boards of selectmen have moved from 3 to 5 members. Providing a level of diversity and experience is helpful. The Essex Regional Retirement Board has 2 elected retiree members. So if you're a retiree of the system, there is an election of all the retirees, and they elect 2 of their own to become members. There is 1 representative of the chief executives of each of the 47 entities that are representative. So I have a vote as to which that representative would be. Those votes are weighted based on the percentage share of each district to the total. So we carry actually 15% of the 100% weighted vote out of 47 communities. I could serve, not that I'm suggesting I do, but although I was unable to continue to serve in the role I had, which was the appointed member of the group, I certainly can serve as all executives can in this particular role. We just elected a new member to that role, Ira Singer, who was a town administrator in Middleton. I've been serving that capacity. He recently retired, and he was replaced by Alan Benson, who's a town administrator in Boxford. The treasurer, the advisory committee or the advisory council is made up of all the treasurer, the financial officers of the representative districts. They select a member of themselves to represent their interests. That's the 4th member, and the 5th member is selected by the other 4 through whatever process they decide. Typically, they'll put something on a website and get responses, and but only people who have no involvement in the district, either as a retiree, active member, or employee, can choose to participate in that. So it's typically intended to be an outside member of the district. In fiscal 2016, the fiscal year actually is calendar year. They operate a little differently than us. Their operating costs are currently they're going through the budget cycle. Looks like they'll be approximately $1.3 million. When I took over chairmanship of that board in 2010, that figure was several $100,000 higher than that, primarily driven by legal bills. They've done an effective job since then of controlling costs. They have 8 full-time employees, I believe 2 part-time employees. They operate out of an office in Danvers. Actually, they own office condominiums. The 1996 enabling legislation allowed them to purchase real estate if they needed to do so, so they operate out of an office condo, really 2 different office condos near the state police barracks in Danvers. It puts them pretty much squarely geographically in the middle of the district. The majority of the investments today, as opposed to 5 years or prior to that, are overseen by the Pension Reserves Investment Trust, or PRIT. PRIT is a state entity which invests, I don't have the aggregate total, I'm sure well in excess of several $billion for various state agencies, state retirement system. It is a place where they have substantial full-time staff who are, professional investors. The Pension Reserves Investment Management Board oversees PRIT. That has been a change in the last 5 years. Interestingly, under the statute, the rule really gives a lot of authority to the individual boards. And one of the things that surprised me when I became a member back in 1995 was that I was informed that I had the authority, along with the other 2 board members, to decide where tens of millions of dollars should be invested, which was a remarkably uncomfortable feeling. That still exists today in local retirement boards. This particular retirement board, before we began to move dollars to an entity that we feel is sort of structured to do that, we managed more than $300 million and had singular voting control as to where those dollars should be placed. Real estate investment trusts, equity funds, and you can see to a certain extent that in that setting, it can become highly political, right? Because people are looking for a portion of those dollars to invest in their particular entities. So you've got a lot of, especially as real estate investment trusts became sort of a hot commodity, sort of pre the real estate crash, folks flying in from throughout the country trying to sort of pitch their particular fund and the return on investment. Over time, as those contracts, because some of those made commitments for multiple years, you don't just simply come in and out of these funds. There was a conscious decision beginning in 2010 when I took the chairmanship and has continued since my departure to move the money into the PRIT. I'm not sure it's 100% there now, but it's close. If it's not 100%, it really is about the rollout on some of these funds which had some shelf life on them. But I think it's a wise, regardless of whether the return is much, if any, better, at least it should make everybody feel more comfortable that experts are investing the $300+ million that are in the retirement system. But it is sort of interesting to note still there is what we call active management by many local boards still today. The state did require some years ago that if you did not perform up to a certain standard over a number of years, then you were required to move your money into PRIT. So that was, I think, a positive step. The history back in, again, 1996 was when the legislation changed. I think to a certain extent the case example of the Essex Regional Retirement Board, which is what it was called at the time, is that to a certain extent when we move governmental entities out of the the sunlight, it becomes increasingly likely that whether either just out of being casual or unprofessional or whatever the circumstances are, we make it increasingly difficult or increasingly likely that those particular bodies will start to take actions which may not be in the best interest of the group. And it's not a political statement. I think it's just been my experience from a practical perspective. So over time, you had a really interesting system. The first member was also the executive director. So instead of having the independence of someone who did the day-to-day, let's use the town manager, board of selectmen example, could you imagine a selectman who was also town manager simultaneously, or superintendent, school committee member? And that's what the structure of that board evolved into. And there was one particular member, before we got into this discussion of remote participation, there was one member who participated regularly, even before there was the statutory allowance for it, from Florida. The executive director, who was also the first member, in essence, negotiated his own contracts with the legal counsel that he hired, and had to be approved by the balance of the board, of which he was the chair. They had legal counsel, on-staff legal counsel reviewing the legal opinions of legal counsel hired by the on-staff legal counsel, and both of them billing the board for it. So it was a really, interesting place, a fair amount of nepotism. In the end, it was a subject of both a DA's investigation, it was a subject of ethics commission investigation, and as I said, PERAC came in with an audit that identified 23 substantial sort of operating deficiencies. Ultimately, none of it appears, ever appeared to be sort of a malfeasance of funds. Certainly wasn't great decision-making and certainly operational costs, which were far in excess of what they needed to be. I think the original spotlight on the entity was about travel to far-off, really sunny states, and a lot of that stuff has changed. So I give credit to the members of the system who started to attend these meetings and started to become aware of the fact that things didn't seem right. They raised awareness with the press. The press sort of became hot on the story, and it covered a lot of the press over a 2-year period. Interesting sidelight was I ended up getting appointed because the chairman, who was the first member, they had gotten so casual, there was a requirement that every 3 years the first member be reappointed because that was the cycle. They had just forgotten to schedule it. And the way that the legislation was written was in the absence of an appointment, PERAC could appoint the position. So as part of their sort of study, they were trying to find ways to sort of solve some of these issues. They determined that the reappointment had not taken place, and so the board quickly rushed in to try to sort of resolve that while PERAC went off and filled the position. Ultimately, Essex Regional Retirement Board at the time sued the state to return the first member back into the chairmanship role, using taxpayer dollars and member dollars to sue the state. And fortunately, the state prevailed. And over a period of 2 years, between new memberships and the hiring of a new executive director, the system really runs very well now. Chuck Costro is excellent. Everything from the transparency on the website of the entity, you see these reports that are posted. The website before never contained information about the names of the directors, when meetings were held, when they were posted. None of that stuff really took place. So there's been a really positive transformation. I give credit to those people who are left behind should feel better about it. But I think the lesson learned is the more we take these entities and we move them out of the spotlight, the greater risk that there is. Eligibility for employees, these are general terms, by the way, employed 20 or more hours. So an employee to be eligible, first of all, Massachusetts municipal employees are not Social Security eligible. It's not optional. The municipality can't choose to be in Social Security versus this system. They can't make up their own system and say we're exempting ourselves. Massachusetts public employees are exempt from Social Security, and therefore this system works in lieu of that. So employees have to work a minimum of 20 hours and have to make at least $5,000 a year to be eligible. When they're eligible, again, it's not a choice. They cannot choose not to participate. They must participate. Because again, there's not this sort of, the federal government requires that there be some level of sort of retirement for every employee, and this is the retirement option. If for some reason the person doesn't qualify under the standard, they're below 20 hours, it's unlikely they're going to be below $5,000 and above 20 hours, so it's more often than not they're part-time employees. If they're below that standard, we are required as employees to withhold what we call OBRA. It's a substitute retirement system, retirement vehicle. It's maybe analogous to a 401k. It's that kind of fund. And so we're required to withhold a similar amount of money and place it into that. That is not optional. If an employee leaves the employee of the community and goes to another community, goes into the private sector, they can withdraw that money without penalty, although they will be taxed, and most of these withholdings to this point are pre-tax. For elected officials are allowed into the system. Their participation, however, is optional. It requires that they make at least $5,000 in any particular year for the year in which they participate, and they must enroll within the first 90 days. After that point, the retirement is deducted from their pay. There's been some recent change. In the past, if an elected official served even 1 day in office in a calendar year, that calendar year was counted in total. They've made some changes to that. I can't speak to all the specifics. There's been so many changes in the industry, but they've made some changes to that. So in the past, an elected official really would have to have 6 elected years of service and be eligible for retirement. Okay? So from a benefits perspective, there are really 3 primary ways to receive benefits from the system. Superannuation is the term that's associated with what I would call traditional retirement. You work X amount of years, you retire, that's called a superannuation retirement. It's a defined benefit, which means there is a, if you ever want to go on to the PERAC website, you can place in fictional information, you can place in how much you made, when you began, when you ended, how many years you had, what your age is, and it'll tell you exactly what your benefit will be. That defined benefit can reach a maximum of 80% of your 3 highest years of compensation. Actually, regular salary can't be, it's not all forms of compensation. That has changed recently as well. They're going to move to, for new employees, 5 years on average and a later retirement age. But for most employees, currently it is 80% of your 3 highest years. That would be a max. So you're not going to receive 80% if you're a non-public safety employee and you work 20 years. You're not going to be anywhere near that number. It might be 40% without getting on and looking at it. But the max would be 80%. That 80% is state tax-free. You pay state tax on the way in, but there's no state tax on the way out. Some just general guidelines: 20 years of service at any age you can retire. So if you accumulate 20 years of service and you happen to be 45, you could retire. Again, the percentage would be extremely low. Sometimes why you see those inactives, you would be better off in that case if you're 45, not retiring, going off to wherever you're going, and then retiring at 65 20 years later, because for non-public safety folks, it's age that's the driving factor as opposed to years of service. You could be 10 years of age and 55, again, allowed to retire, but everything is, it's a combination of your age and years of service that drives the percentage. Again, maximum of 80%. Survivor benefit, if you would accept 66 2/3% of what you would otherwise be eligible for, then there's survivor benefits, which means if you predecease your spouse, and your spouse would continue to earn that until they decease. If your spouse predeceases you, then there's a pop-up provision that gets you back to the 80%. No state income tax, talked about that. Group 1, there are Group 1, 2, 3, and 4 employees. 2 and 3 are very, very rare, so there's not a lot of need to speak about them. Group 1 are most public employees. Everything's weighted toward age in that case. I'll use myself as an example. I left the public sector, or the private sector at age 30. Worked to 64 or 65 to get to 80%. So about 34, 35 years, because it's age-weighted. If I had started at age 21, I'd probably still have to get pretty close to 62 or 63 before I got to the same 80%, because it's age-weighted. Public safety folks, it's more years of service-weighted. So if you started at age 30, you might be 5 years or more earlier to get to the 80%. Again, the general trend back when these systems were originally created, where public safety officials started earlier, the nature of the job was you wanted them out of the service in the public safety agencies by 55, 56. The general trend right now, quite frankly, it used to be like clockwork. I could list the schedule of the 200 employees, and if I took the public safety folks, I could tell you when they were retiring to the day, right? Today, we're seeing public safety employees last well beyond 55, which is the common retirement age. 60 is not that uncommon, which is a change generally in terms of people's lifestyle. And the retirement systems and the legislature are sort of catching up to that, because they need to recognize the fact that people living longer and working longer, then the contribution rates need to change. There is 2 alternative methods for retirement. Both relate to disability. There's an ordinary disability, means you're no longer capable of doing your job as determined by an independent medical panel. These are not arbitrary standards in which I decide I'm no longer able to do my job. They have to go through a medical panel, and that's also reviewed by PERAC. If that's the case, it's 50%. If it's an accidental disability, God forbid someone get injured in the line of duty, or a DPW worker, happen to get injured, that they no longer, again, can perform the essential functions of their job, that's the standard, then they'd be entitled to 72%. Once an employee is retired, it should be noted that there are cost of living increases. They are voted annually by the retirement board. Different than, say, a Social Security, that cost of living increase is only on the first $13,000 of pension, and it never exceeds 3%. So in essence, for, I think the average municipal retirement is just south of $30,000 a year. For those folks, the first $13,000, they get a 3% benefit, and it would be added to, that, say the pension was $29,000, and that's what they're entitled to. That's the limit. At one point, I think it was $12,000. They've raised that bar. I think the retirement board has a local option to increase that to $15,000 or $16,000, but the regional retirement board has limited it to $13,000. As it relates to funding, there are really a couple of ways that the system receives its money. First of all, employees contribute, and the schedule in which they contribute is defined there. If you were hired before 1975, you contribute 5% of your pay pre-tax. Between 1975 and 1983, 7% is taken out of your pay, and if you were hired between 1984 and June 30th of 1996, you contribute 8%. After July 1 of 1996, it goes to 9%. After the first 30,000, all of these categories have an additional 2%. So the first 30,000 are taxed or withheld at these levels. Every dollar above 30,000 has an additional 2%. So every dollar from 30,000 up for someone who was hired, let's say in 1996, would be 10%. Okay? And so on. I think I defined that next. There was some reform to this which talks about a little more aggressive schedule so that the folks that are hired after, I think sometime in 2012, after they get the 30 years, that withholding actually will be decreased. And it sounds counterintuitive, but part of the reason for that is they have to work longer to receive the same benefit the employees in the other categories now get. So it has been determined that in most cases, anytime the legislature wants to amend the benefits received by public employees, the public employee is assumed to have an implied contract at the time they're hired. So you can't take an existing employee and decide 10 years in that you're going to alter the benefit from when they first were hired. So most legislative change is prospective. There's some slight examples to that, but so most of the changes are, that's why these rates didn't change. They didn't look back and change the 5%ers to 7. They just kept on kicking that ball up the road. It's the same case here. You need to work longer to retire based on the 2011 reform legislation, but since you're going to work longer and you're going to have the higher amount taken out, when you get 30 years in, they're going to reduce that contribution. Okay? Someone with an actuarial degree figured this all out. I certainly didn't. As it relates to the appropriation, so there's the employee's contribution. We pay into the systems ourselves, and then the employers contribute as well. That's what gets us here, right? So our contribution, our appropriation for fiscal 17 is $4,409,000. It increases at about 7% a year. We're going to talk about that briefly, which puts it in the range of between $320,000 and $340,000 a year. And those decisions are made on the following bases. There are three components to the appropriation. The actual appropriation that we receive, the bill we pay, is the normal cost. The normal cost relates to today, so many people are retired and receive a check. What's the cost of carrying those folks? That'd be the simplest way to define the normal cost. The unfunded actuarial accrued liability is that piece of the retirement which relates to setting aside dollars for people who are currently employed but will eventually retire, assuming the actuarial tables that, again, those actuaries use. How long will every male live? How long will every female live? And using mortality tables and existing payroll schedules, every 2 years the system goes through an effort of determining what that unfunded actuarial liability is. The statute says that that liability must be fully funded by 2035. Okay? So that's been kicked down the road a few times. I can tell you in 1995, I wish I knew the date, I think the full funding schedule was about 20 years out. And here I am 20 years later, and the full funding schedule is 20 years out. This is what differentiates retirement boards, retirement systems from OPEB. OPEB is a balance sheet entry with no requirement to fund the liability at this point. Retirement systems are required not only to pay as you go, but set aside dollars to pay for the future liability of the system. And so you will see the unfunded actuarial liability when you look at the actual funding schedule is the bigger elephant in the room compared to the normal cost. There's also net 3HC payments, so without boring you with details. People come into the system, they leave the system. So if I came in from Swampscott, I came with famous Swampscott, North Andover reference, the bag of money. It didn't come with me, it went to the retirement system, so the dollars that I had placed into the system came with me. They went to the Essex Regional Retirement Systems. The net of that in and out, between people coming in and out of the system, are the 3HC payments, and those are a factor in this. Pretty steady factor, though. I've given you a copy of the 1114 actuarial study. It provides all kinds of detail, charts, specific information about the average age of employees within the system, which is around 49. That has steadily been increasing, I think, across the state as we see people employed longer and coming to work later. It gives us some general idea of what's happening in terms of retirement system returns, payroll, and the like. The primary assumptions that drive the appropriation, that drive the questions about normal costs and unfunded liability, are the assumed rate of return of the system, what happens with the assets as we give it to PRIT, what's the return. Historically, that number, and I mean historically for decades, was 8.5%. And since the stock market return was north of that, the retirement systems generally did pretty well. Retirement systems are now moving that figure lower and lower, because the reality is the market in the last 10-year view is not the same as it was in the previous 80-year view. So the 8.5 has become 8%. I wouldn't be surprised if the Essex Regional Retirement System eventually lowers that figure to 7.75. We'll see what happens over time. The current mortality rates are used, so every time they do an actuarial study, they use the updated mortality schedules. And there's an assumption of salary increases because payroll dollars ultimately drive not only normal cost, but the unfunded cost. The way this system, and I can't speak to why I didn't ask the questions at the time, traditionally salary increases are assumed around the 4 to 4.5% within these studies. The way this one was done was an aggressive, conservative number up front, 7.5%, then it goes to 6.5% and 6 and 5.5. Ultimately, 6 years in, it comes down to a 375 number, which is a traditional number. So I don't know what originally told them to sort of forward stack that, but my guess is they were trying to be somewhat conservative just in case investment returns didn't come back. The appropriation gets calculated in total, and then they apply the relationship of our membership to the total based on payroll. So we represent something like 14.87% of all the payroll of all of the systems within Essex Regional Retirement, and therefore we get the weighted vote when it comes to those elections, and we also pay 14.87% of the appropriation. Again, the actuarial study is updated every 2 years. The funding ratio currently is 49%. I think at times it probably was as high as 60%, depending on the market return. Again, the market has been so difficult to manage from years past that these numbers are all over the place. When technically that funding ratio needs to be at 100% by 2035. And at that point, the unfunded liability technically would go away. And if you look at the difference in appropriation, it would be the order of magnitude well into the 7 figures when the unfunded piece goes away. That's why the goal is always to get rid of the unfunded liability. The expectation under the actuarial study that you have is that you will see 7% increases between now and 2021. Those will decrease to approximately 4% between 2022 and 2035. And as I repeated earlier, the fiscal 17 appropriation is 4409. The appropriation last year, I think, was 330. In the current year, was $338,000 less than that. So that's my really quick overview of retirement systems in Essex. And I'll answer whatever questions I can.
Thank you very much. I guess I was looking at the funding schedule that's either in the Perrick memo. I think it's probably the easiest place to find it in page 2. So I was just looking at it, and actually, if you could explain kind of the columns going left to right.
Sure.
how those work. I think that'd be
I
great.
guess, not all the columns are relevant to the subject of appropriation, but the very first column is that normal cost. So that's your pay-as-you-go cost.
Right.
What does it cost today? If I added up all the individual, you need a copy of that? If I needed to cover the costs associated with the people who are in the retirement system today, active members who are receiving checks, how do I cover that bill? So when I add all the deductions that are coming from people's current employees with holdings, so that those deductions don't just sort of travel with employees, those go into the fund. So we're forward funding in that case. We're using existing dollars to fund some of the cost of the system, and then we need an additional 5534881 in 2016, $534,881 to cover the normal cost. The next figure, next column, represents the aggregate liability for those future costs for everybody that's in the system, actives, inactives, and retirees. That balance, that figure, is $371 million. And so
There's no money set aside for that?
that is what you're setting aside for. So built into every appropriation is getting down, you're trying to pay down. If you look at that column, it starts at 371, and by 2035 it goes away.
We're 14% of that number.
We're 1487% of that number.
Balance, the starting balance of 2015 or 16.
Balance of what?
What is set aside to fund that
The
liability?
market value of the system is identified in the third page of the sheet I gave you. The market value to what's in the system today, assets in the system, $344 million, fourth line from the bottom,
Yeah.
$344,991,750. That's the asset value of the system. That goes up and down every day based upon whatever happens in the market. Okay?
Okay.
So what is required is that in addition to PAYGO, paying your current costs, that they first have to calculate what the unfunded liability is, and in turn, develop a schedule which can't extend beyond what's required under the statute, and pay that down every year.
It's a forced pay down.
It's a forced pay down. And the only thing that changes that is so here's what changes the schedule. Every 2 years, between the 2-year period, something's going to happen. You made an assumption of 8% return. If it's a 7% return,
Right.
then
Stretches out.
it's going up, right? And you can't extend it any further, so you're stuck on the funding schedule. I think 36 is actually the last year. They may have gone 1 year short of that. And you can have payroll changes, so maybe the payroll, given the fact they started at 7.5 on payroll, that's very high. Because it can be other payroll costs. It's not just COLAs that you may see. It could be additional staff as the economy gets better. People hire some people back. That adds to payroll. So in between the actuarial periods, the actuarial then will come in and say, okay, where were you relative to the aggregate payroll of 7.5%? Where were you in terms of market return? And then they recalculate this whole process again. The funding amortization of the $371 million is the fourth column. Funding amortization of UAAL. That is the current year cost that we have to pay in, we're 14.87%, of that $371 million. So it gets paid out. Okay? I explained the 3/8C payments. Again, those are left generally flat. So the ins and outs of the system work out to be about $1 million a year. And when you add the pieces together, you end up with scheduled contributions, and there's some footnotes as to the adjustments associated with those. And then when we design these systems, part of what has to be made as decisions with, and this is all with the retirement board, is how do you want this smoothing to look, right? There were some requirements when you extended the funding schedules out to 2020, 2035, where the state said, well, you can't just give yourself a break for the first couple of years. You have to see this as a mitigating or reducing impact. You got to start higher on the percentages. I think the one from 13 before the market returns were strong was an 8% increase. So you see the market return in the year of calendar 13 exceeded the bogey of 8%, strong enough to force these down to 7%. Now, since that time, it's been a little schizophrenic. So when they come back to another valuation period, the question will be, will this be back up to 8%? And will they change some of the criteria associated with that? Yep. So I certainly would expect over the next several years, at least 7%, could very well be 8%, depending on what happens on market returns. So it is the retirement. So let's say, for instance, that we have one of these years we had, I think, in the late 1980s, and it's a 28% return. I think in 1995, from no doing it myself, the retirement system the retirement board I was on was #1 in the state. We had a 32% return. I had nothing to do with it. And I'm not sure the investment managers had anything to do with it. It was just forcing it, right? That can have a huge impact, but the retirement system then gets to decide what it wants to do with that. Do they spread that out over this? Do they shorten, there's some people who would advocate, well, I don't want to be in 2035 anymore. I want to pay down that unfunded liability. Do we shorten the schedule? And so the retirement board makes those individual systems, those individual decisions, within some constraints of what PERAC sees as reasonable.
So what would they do, move it into more conservative investments rather than to try to pay that down, or have it set aside, or?
No, they literally would alter the schedule. So they would just simply alter the schedule.
Change the mix, they just.
No, the mix, again, now that there's not active management on Essex especially, Essex will have no influence on how PRIT invests money, because PRIT, again, is investing, oh God, it has to be tens of billions of dollars.
Tweak a little, but not by a lot, right?
This is Fidelity on steroids. It's that kind of, the nature of the entity is that's what they do. They're an investment entity.
It's almost like church funds.
Yeah.
Question for you. I'm a financial planner and live in the industry.
Yeah.
So the first question I have is on page 17. It says 8% net of investment expenses. So the assumption on the investment return for actuarial assumptions is well over 8%, correct?
Net of expenses. It's not well over that. Part of the reason to move to PRIT, and I wish I had the exact information for it, the cost of investing admin fee associated with less than active management is far lower. So the problem with the active management is not just the retirement members like myself who didn't know what we were doing. It's that you're paying 13 investment advisors. Yep.
This follow-up question is, if there's a shortfall, what responsibility does the town have to cover?
It's not a
Okay,
yes, it's not a shortfall, as you know. We pay the appropriation as listed. We get a letter which looks like exactly like this, similar to this, but it's specific to our town. We make that payment. There is no shortfall. The shortfall, in essence, is in a calculation, right, in an actuarial study. So every 2 years, we recalibrate this report based upon actual data and translate what this study says into what needs to get paid. So if the investment return were 5%, and the recalibration said, well, we're going to restate the schedule between now and 2035. So instead of $28 million, what the system needs every year is $29 million. Then we'll pay 14.87% of that $29 million. So it's done as a function. It's driven by the actuarial study done every 2 years.
The next one is coming up.
So there's not like an in-year. It's like regular government. We have an appropriation. We'll receive a letter which indicates exactly how much we pay. We already know what that figure is, $4,403,000. That's exactly what we will pay.
How is the town allowed to plan ahead, though, for that amount to be put in our lap?
That's exactly what this is. This is an assumption based by independent folks that specialize in that business that will look at the actual study and plan on this schedule. Now, do I think, from experience, I think this is reasonable, but would I expect that it's possible you could see an 8%? Yeah.
So
Sure.
if we make the judgment call that we may think this is a little bit high for investment return,
Yep.
then we have to make the decision to...
No, we don't have any influence in that. The influence we have is
to set aside money to then pay in, because we expect a bigger bill. I'm saying in layman's terms, sorry, but...
No, but even in layman's terms, from governmental terms, we can't set aside dollars for that purpose. An appropriation is a discrete amount of money within a 12-month period. So if our appropriation is $4,403,000, then if we appropriate $4,503,000, and for the benefit of holding that aside when that fiscal year ends, we lose, the 100,000 drops to the bottom line. So we influence as best we can to make sure that the retirement systems are thinking conservatively.
Right.
And balance that around making sure they're not so conservative as to impact sort of operations. Yep.
When was actually this decision made to balance or to have the unfunded liability covered in
Yeah, it was,
2035?
it was, the decision of 2035 was in the last couple of years. Before that, I believe it was 2027. So the state dictates when that's going to be. There was a change, I think it really came out of the 08, 09 crash, that there was a decision that if they didn't alter the funding of the unfunded liability, if they didn't allow districts to move the 2027 back to 2035, then the impact on the appropriation would be so significant when combined already with revenue loss on the state side that communities just couldn't have handled it. So what the state says, we'll allow districts to move, or retirement boards to move the 2027 date to 2035 under certain conditions, one of them being that it needed to be front-loaded rather than back-loaded, that they didn't want them to come in at 4% rolling up to 8%, that they go the other way. So you had to comply with a certain standard, and then you were allowed to move it back. The system didn't have to decide to move it back, but again, whether it's a local system or a regional system, they're balancing, making sure they're not crushing local budgets with the fact that they have a fiduciary responsibility to fund the system.
I mean, this is now maybe a little bit more complicated, but I mean, there are like now a couple of towns involved, and some towns are maybe doing better than other towns, and but they all, get the same calculation.
Yes.
So this is the same actual report, and your percentage is the same. What if a town say, well, I can't do it?
Yeah, it'd be a good question. If they didn't pay them, then I guess they'd have to remove them from the system and take their assets. Any one of the individual systems could remove themselves and through legislative relief and become independent. You need a retirement system. I assume they could remove themselves. I'm sure that the issue at the time when they created a regional system was largely driven by economies of scale, right? How do you manage the staff, those kind of things. So ultimately, I'm not aware of a case that's happened, because ultimately the retirees also want to get paid. So I don't know what would happen in that case. It's a little bit of the sword of Damocles, I think. No one wants to be in that spot.
So the next report is coming out soon, or I don't know if it's coming out soon, but
It'll start soon.
Does it take? So it's as of January 1st,
Yes.
2016. Is it out on January 1st, or is
it'll
then?
be months. This one, the spacing was almost 12 months. Time PARAC reviews it and they determine the schedule. That'll be a while. It won't affect the 17th budget.
Well, we'll be interested how the schedule looks.
Yeah, well, the investment returns have not been good,
No.
so that'll certainly be a driving factor. It'll be interesting to see if the retirement board itself decides to alter the investment rate of return assumption from 8% lower. That wouldn't be surprising or unheard of, quite frankly. Today, retirement costs constitute about 5% of who we are from an operating budget perspective. They're increasing faster than our operating costs. Not as fast as health insurance did way back when, but certainly they're not insignificant. I do think that at least some initial steps have been taken. It took a long time, but the 09 and 11 changes have started to understand that people work longer, live longer, and at least have started to look at some of the considerations. Averaging your final 5 years as opposed to 3 was a good step. Looking at some of the disability issues, realizing that people retire at a later age, changing the contribution rates. I think those begin to take hold. You won't see it in the first couple of actuarial studies, quite frankly, because right now we're largely comprised of that first group. But I would think about 10 years from now, you'll start to see the positive impact of moving people to a less rich plan. How much, I think, is yet to be determined. And I do think there needs to be more legislative action to make the plan more, just to identify what's happening in the industry.
So you're saying they're not going, the defined benefits are not being altered, right?
No, it's the defined benefits aren't being altered, but the contributions and how they calculate your benefit are being, so the answer, I guess, one way to answer your question would be yes. If today an employee retires and they've determined their wages based upon the 3 highest years, and it'll become the 5 highest years, it's likely to mitigate in some small way. One of the The big changes is what they call an anti-spiking provision. So you could go part-time, 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 or 25 hours, jump to 35 hours in the last 3 years, and the 80% was based on the 3 highest years. They've removed some of those provisions. There was an ability to double dip and join 2 systems simultaneously and really draw benefits from both, which have worked to address. There was the ability to be in what's called Group 1 and jump to Group 4 late in the process, which had an escalate schedule. So they're starting to take the steps to address both those loopholes and the things that are common sense. We employ people well into their 70s today. That was just never the case. People, every police officer and firefighter retired at 55, and every municipal employee retired at 65. Today, that's just not the case. So they're starting to understand that and factor it into the decisions you make.
And I have here, there was actually in the, the annual financial report from last year. There's a very detailed how actually that unfunded liability developed. Started, in 2000 was at 63 million. Now it's at 371 million. So it more than, what's that, 6, 7, almost
Part of
six-folded.
part of that's more the allocation of being underfunded relative to your investment return.
Yeah, but it went also from 75% down to below 50%.
Yep.
So, I mean, there was a trend.
Not a good trend.
No.
No.
So we'll see if that is really stopped now with the next,
Yeah.
like, how is actually, if I compare that pension plan to the Social Security pension, is it
It's a great question. So
comparable?
there was a study done by Mass teachers in 2011. I can forward to you folks. And so what I can give you is information. I don't know enough to other than what I read, right? So it indicates based on their calculations and with actuarial support that they're very comparable. That they're, because an employer is required to set aside 6.2% on Social Security. We have employees now that the belief is that on the newest employees, they're contributing 95% of their own retirement, which is higher than what you would do under Social Security. So there's a little bit of a misnomer because people think you're doing both. And so there's a substantial amount of contribution in by employees. And so most of the data seems to indicate that it's, this, that they're fairly comparable. That maybe there's the edge is a defined benefit, but technically Social Security is a defined benefit if you look at the scale of how many years and cut across, right? And that the COLAs associated with Social Security are based on the total amount of money you get from Social Security. So your annual amount, whatever you receive from Social Security, however modest the COLA is based on the total. Here the COLA is simply based on the first 13,000. So if you happen to be a municipal police officer, retired 80% and get 40,000, you're not going to see that 40,000 change for probably, really in any meaningful way. What's 3% of 13,000? 10, 1, $390. So you're not going to see that 40,000 change in any meaningful way for the 30 years you survive. That's why people are staying longer as it relates to these positions, because you can't retire at 55 unless you're willing to go get another position. The law restricts how you can work within another municipality, so it limits to 960 hours the amount of hours you could work. So if you left one governmental unit and went to work for another, you wouldn't be allowed to retire again, but it further restricts the amount of hours you can work in that other municipality. So you may be around all day, but you can't, so you'd have to go, work for the private sector or something else.
There's a mortality table in here, not that I need one, but would you happen to know what the age is if it's 90 or 100 and all this? No idea.
I leave that to the people who know mortality tables. I'm just trying to make it to 54.
I know you are.
That's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just get to 54, it's, be good. Try not to be a figure on here. I'm trying to get to be able to...
Walking and healthy. Let's add that. You can get to an age, it's whether you're walking and getting out of a chair.
I'd like figures, the actual.
It's actually interesting to see, if you look at all the way out, the last payment in 2085 or so, no, actually longer out, probably in 2100, how they calculate all that out. It's amazing.
It is pretty amazing what they do. That's
And
good for them. Not a profession I think I would probably enjoy, but
I have a friend who's an actuator for the Teamsters.
Really?
And I check every couple of months to make sure he's still there.
The only thing we all know is that men don't live as long as women. That's what we know, right? And that is somehow captured in the mortality tables as well.
So we look at now 10 years, 15 or 20 years out, how, percentage of the total budget will make the payment into the pension plan?
Yeah, so today is excess of 4,405. It's close on the general fund side only, which isn't a completely fair comparison because some of these employees are within the enterprise funds as well. But if it's just for simple math, you're at about 5% of your general fund budget. I think you're going to see increase to that because you're looking at a 7% annual growth on that figure versus an average budgetary growth. We're currently in a 3 to 4% mode, but quite frankly, that's not where, we keep on saying that's not going to happen next year, and we've been pretty fortunate. Now I understand why we're fortunate. I understand from the minutes, but we're fortunate enough that the growth has been a little greater than we thought it might be. But eventually we'll return to the 3%, and this will continue at 7%, so that delta will grow a little bit. I don't think we're going to talk about 10% of budget, like health insurance was going to 25% before we made the changes. But it'll go up, 20 basis points or so, 10 basis points. So maybe in 10 years you're talking 7% of general fund. That'd be an estimate. I think I once did an estimate and said when you get to it might have been 2030 that you might start to approach 10%, but I'm not sure it'll quite get to that level.
So the message really is, here's the plan, we're following it, it's impactful, but there's not much we can do. We're all in the water at the same time with everybody else.
Yeah. I think that the one piece I may have mentioned in passing. So we have really two groups of employees on an overarching way. We have municipal employees and school employees. The school employees are funded by the Master Teachers Retirement System. That entire system is funded by the Commonwealth. This is our municipal folks and not the other side, so we don't see those. Yeah, I think that's a great summary. The good news on this is every couple of years you have an actuarial evaluation, and maybe you don't like the news, but at least you get the news. You know what the assumptions are going to be. We try to participate as aggressively as possible with the retirement board. It's helpful both to have some experience, but also helpful that when you're 14.87%, we try to indicate when we think they're going in a direction that isn't ideal, but that's a balancing act for us too, because I would much rather see them, not from budgetary purposes, go to a 775 number because it's far more realistic to what we're doing. And so from that point of view, I'd rather see the retirement board not have to see wild swings in these appropriations because their assumptions weren't right.
I just want to bring one thing
sure.
in here. On page 13, it talks about an 8% interest rate assumption within a reasonable range. But on page 17, it talks an 8% per year net of investment expenses.
Correct.
That's a 1%. I mean, I know what investment expenses could be. That's a mismatch. Unless they're meaning 8% interest rate net of investment expenses.
Right. Yeah, I can ask the question.
No, I don't need you to answer.
Yeah.
If you're relying on this, I would.
Well, I do rely on it because it's done by the people that specialize in this.
Yeah.
I got hung up more in the fact that the interest rate, it's a question I actually have to ask because I was hung up in the fact that they're using interest rate in one section of the report and investment return in the other, and I don't think that they're analogous or synonymous. I think the interest rate is tied into something else.
Okay.
And so that's what I need. So, because
because when you read it.
One says interest rate, right?
Absolutely. I would never call that interest rate there. When you say return on equities, I would say that's investment return.
And so I didn't have time to ask the question. I went through and I noted the same thing. That interest rate is not synonymous with investment rate of return. If that is, that's a really...
Well, it's in the same paragraph, so it's definitely a confusing.
Yeah, I think
anyway,
it's different. I think it's different, and I have to figure out what that is,
Yeah,
what the interest rate relates to, and I'll forward that in the form of an email. It's a great question.
No,
Appreciate
it's.
it. So it's, we get a plan. Wish for good things in the market. Invest in Weight Watchers. It helped. We just needed to know that Oprah was going to buy in. It went from $4 to $20. Why don't we ever get this information in here?
Let me think.
We wouldn't be here, that's right. I wouldn't have to worry about getting to 54. I'll just get out of here when I can.
If you didn't know, you'd be in an SEC
Hey,
investigation.
Yes, a few, maybe, a few.
Martha Stewart survived and came back, right? So we're all good. Any other questions while I'm here? And can I help?
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's great, enjoy yourself.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrew. So that was our major and really, that was our major agenda item for the evening, was to get the update on the pension system. And I think it was informative and far-reaching. And then looking out on the agenda for December 1st, Dr. Price was going to visit just to introduce herself before the school department budget comes. So that's kind of the placeholder there. And then,
Is she presenting the tentative?
no, this is just
Anything.
like an introduction.
Intro?
Yeah, an introduction. Because
Okay.
what I wanted to do is to have her to have a chance to just talk before the budget, before we're looking at numbers and kind of grilling her, just to come in and say hello. So
Mm-hmm. Okay.
it's a introductory.
Because she'll come back and talk about what they want, and
Yeah.
the $1 million that you were
Yeah.
talking about, that'll be later?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We give everybody one free pass,
I was just wondering.
even Stan. So.
You need to match me, guys.
And then on the 15th, Jim Mealy will come in with the latest update, school budget update that he's going to give to the school committee on the 3rd of December. So those were the two items.
You had made a mention about Eric, I mispronounced his name, Kfoury.
We could invite him, Kafori.
Kafoury coming in about the
Right,
business development.
Yes, we could invite him. So I'm open to consider that for the agenda. I could extend an invitation to either one of those days. Do we want to do that?
I think that
Okay.
factors into our future. quite a
It
bit.
kind of is the business
So
revenue.
just an
isn't it?
off-cycle kind of meeting to talk about what he
Hey, what's
sees coming
going
down the
on?
pike.
Give us free pass.
December 1st, maybe. December 1st, probably.
Well, I'll invite him.
Oh,
I'll give him the
right, whatever you-
choice, you think,
Yeah.
on the 2 days?
Yeah.
And, well, yeah, I agree. And then from there, the next section of our, calendar-wise, we'll start to get into, we'll start having some capital budget items after, we're not going to meet again in December after the 15th. And I imagine we won't meet until January. But what I have to do between now and then is sort of figure out, I have the schedule of when different budgets are coming due. So then, what we have to work on the next couple of weeks is, we'll schedule a few hearings on the CIP. Obviously, that's like our December, February, and then late February to March is when we have the department operating budgets.
Will we be
So we'll-
having a department heads, Bill, or what's that look like?
So, we will have, we'll invite the department heads and set them up to come in.
As we talked earlier.
As we talked
kind of
earlier.
Walk through that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll invite them. We just have to, there are certain milestones, so that part of the calendar is is much more rigid, and we gotta just make sure we hit all our
They
deadlines.
don't come in before they have that sort figured out.
Right.
They want to come in after? Is that the deal?
Yeah, they come in, yeah.
You need to understand what they came to as opposed to.
Right.
Okay.
And how they came to it. Right.
Yeah.
More transparency.
So definitely, and I would say the Tuesday nights seem to be, the preferable night. I know it's
Just keep it the same.
preferable for me, and then it seems like it's the best night we got so far, and then we'll stick with Tuesday nights, and then we'll layer in all the different dates, make sure we hit all the milestones, and invite everybody in. So I think we can, firm up the schedule for January and February over the next 2 meetings. So we'll get those kind of booked out, and then we'll book out March and April. And we'll layer in a couple extra weeks for, a couple extra meetings for snow days, so. You know.
No snow budget.
Yeah, yeah.
With that, because going into tonight, every time there's a meeting, there'll be an agenda and attachments in advance put in Dropbox.
Yes, so I was going to
Please
talk
tell
to you
me-
because,
I'm a little,
because
That's
we need to
something
get you on the, there's a FinCom
I have the Dropbox.
distribution.
And I have the
Yeah.
FinCom, and I do, but it works sometimes and other times it's not. Her and I were talking about that.
Really? Okay.
Really, it's very
The
specific.
FinCom
And
mailing
she
list?
just helped me with the, for Dropbox, because I was looking at the master Dropbox with the
Right.
FinCom, with the, I'm all confused. But the
There's an
F-17, I was looking at 14, 15, 17, and everything else. I
But
was,
some of the stuff does end up just dumped outside.
It does, it did.
well, we,
Yeah.
Talking about that earlier,
Yeah.
it's got to be better organized and
Yeah.
filed.
but do we have the power to organize our FinCom folder at least, so that anything that's for us goes into a FinCom folder?
I'll find out who the admin is on it. I'm not really sure how it works, if you can just
always
move
drag
things
it into
around, or
folder on your own
if you can drag it or drop it. Yeah.
I want it organized from the top, but
Yeah.
I understand
No,
what you're
I
saying.
think we should put everything, no, I think we can put it in by meeting and then by
The
budget.
presenting goes in there before
Yeah,
we come
yeah, yeah.
to
Yeah.
meeting.
And so, no, but the agenda does come out, and did come out, so, you know, because what I've been trying to do, because I think when you have like 9 individual email addresses, the chances that somebody gets dropped from one communication to another are very high. So, you know, I think we got to go back to the IT department and say, you know, test this, maybe do a couple tests and make sure that everyone's getting every email that goes to FinCom. Because that's the idea, that everybody is captured in FinCom at townofnorthandover.com. Everything goes out, and we don't miss anything. And that's the one that we're going to use if we have to cancel a meeting or something like that.
It's extremely
That's right, 'cause you
helpful
can
if you
use
have it
text.
forwarded to your personal email, if you're not in the habit of checking your North Andover email.
I have
Yeah.
my personal, I'm still not getting it.
You have
I
it forwarded to your
two
personal?
emails on it on purpose,
Yeah.
my work and my personal, it's still not getting to me.
It's supposed to be forwarded from Town of North Andover to
Yeah.
GovCAM. It's not working, yeah.
No. Come on. It's just-
His name was Christopher. I don't know his
Chris
last
McClure is his name.
Chris
Chris
McClure?
McClure.
Okay.
Oh.
And he's in the GAL, right? He should be in the global address list.
There was something else.
So, yeah, no, I want, we should have that working 100%.
The personal phenomenon that I experience relative to the town's emails is the fact that every time I sign up for the school committee distribution, nothing. You can hear the crickets.
Even though I get the opposite.
Really?
It's very strategic. You know, there are filters and all that.
Yeah.
Are we talking about social media? I thought I did come as my homework prepared.
No, I forgot to throw it back on the agenda, but we can,
I can just tell you, because this might just end it.
Right.
The thought, the town of Andover has an Andover Mass on Twitter, that nobody really has much on LinkedIn, to be honest with you, despite what I said. The town of Andover has the Gov feeds, so they have everything from the trash news to the retirement of police to general news to appointments. And then Andover Mass is the other feed, which is the community feeds, like the fun, I'm having, you know, whatever, parties and stuff. And then Haverhill, nobody really is, no town close to us is doing anything from this committee publicly. No town. And then I went to Newton, and I went really far into the city. Nothing.
Does that mean we shouldn't do anything, or we should be the first one?
I mean, I just think it's the way people get there. To me, it's kind of simple, because it's the way people, you know, for better or worse, get their news these days. You know?
If they're interested and want to be involved, it'll be part of it on Twitter.
On Twitter and
Yeah.
Facebook and.
Well, it's already being televised. I mean, the whole thing, you know, 10 years ago, the concept of televising FinCom even just seemed alien. Why would you ever do that? 5 years ago. Well, right, and even 5 years ago, it's like, well, I guess we can talk about it, and now it's like, so, you know, I think there's an evolution. So if people have interest, they'll pick up on it. I think there's just not a lot of interest in municipal events.
I think people are getting pushed information, so I think the difference
Right.
between what you're saying in the Twitter is, it lands up in your email box,
Yeah,
it lands up in your face.
Right, you don't have
If
to
you
push-
don't do
you don't have
that,
to pull it.
they're not going to pick up that they even should follow it, to be honest.
I agree with that.
So as much as nobody wants to offer doing it, which I don't want to offer.
Either way, I ignore it anyway.
You would, but it's the certain generation of taxpayers that
Yeah.
should not be
Well, maybe
ignoring.
we should talk to the school. I mean,
Yeah.
Dr. Price, that might be part of our conversation with Dr. Price. She is, very proactive, and she's brought a whole dynamic here. Maybe we could learn a little something from her experience, as really think of it as a pilot for the town. So maybe we approach her with that discussion.
December 1st at our meeting.
Yeah, that's a-
How's it been going? Has she seen increased membership in her
How
Twitter
do you do it? Why do you
followers
do it?
every month? Because we don't know how, but the question is there been a graduating number of people following her? And okay, that's a great idea. I could ask the principal too. Nobody else in the town does Twitter, though. This is only the schools are doing Twitter, right?
I
As far as we
don't
know. Andrew, he's not doing Twitter. Andrew, I should have asked.
Is Andrew on Twitter?
Is he on Twitter?
No.
Yeah. That's interesting. The schools are, but not, yeah.
But Dr. Price has been very successful.
Well, the schools are on it.
But that's
The
not what-
town is,
But
doesn't,
the parents are, but, you've got, a generation of parents who are.
But it's all like it's one after the other. Like if Dr. Price follows us, people who follow Dr. Price will see, oh, Jen Price is following
Yeah.
NA FinCom.
Yes.
And then people will start following it because
Yes.
they're like, oh, this
Yes.
is, so it's, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy and,
Citizens.
reinforcing loops.
Kind of light their torches and show up out here.
Right.
You gotta maintain that.
well, that's my concern is what are we allowed to say? Who's going to write it and who's going to post it?
Right, I mean, I think it's
I
think it's
agree
pretty
with you.
simple, and it's like, it's a push out. It would not be like a dialogue, it would not be like, what do you think of the town
No,
budget?
it'd be
But it would be like,
factual.
we're having a meeting, here's
On the agenda.
here's the budget policy statement put forward by the
Yes.
Board of
Here are the
Selectmen,
documents.
Under 140 characters.
Yeah,
Or,
Here are the documents.
As soon as we get it,
It's true if you could put a URL to the Dropbox.
Yeah, you just put a web
That's
link.
all public, you're right. I mean, I
It's all
don't,
public hearing. You already got it.
Well, when you would really get attention if you just put out a tweet. The ESSEC retirement fund has a unfunded liability of $370 million. Without any comment at all.
Don't like that one.
Just
Nice, nice.
so we don't have,
It's still, Stan would be the only one here.
Andover's
Yeah.
only like crazy. Andover's, like I said, like the 2 feet.
But if you want to
They've posted
get people
anything.
involved, I guess that's.
It'd be good if you had something
Tournaments of
controversial.
people on Twitter. Oh, yeah, they're big. They have
We
Andover
haven't had anything
Mass
recently.
and then they have Andover Mass, which is just the community. Yeah,
we did a session
and
on,
then Newton, the mayor.
the pros and cons of
Yeah.
pay-as-you-throw, we would have full room.
Just run it all with a match. Just looking for something I like. Don't stop.
You good?
Okay. Do we have a motion?
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
No.